I was 37 years old when Hurricane Andrew reminded me how small a human can be. Back in 1992, I lived alone in a modest one-story house in Homestead, Florida. It wasn't much, but it was the place I had built piece by piece, and maybe that is why I refused to leave it. Every warning on the radio repeated the same message, urging everyone to evacuate before the storm made landfall. I heard those warnings all day, but I kept convincing myself that I had been through hurricanes before and that this one wouldn't be different. My neighbors packed their cars and left early. The streets emptied quickly, and soon the entire neighborhood felt unnaturally quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I stayed behind, telling myself I needed to protect my home. I checked the shutters twice, reinforced the windows, and stored water and food like I had done many times before. In my mind, preparation equaled safety. I truly believed that. By noon the sky changed into a strange greenish tone I had never seen in my life. The air felt thick and tense, almost electrical, as if the atmosphere itself knew what was coming. I tried to distract myself with small, pointless tasks, organizing tools, adjusting furniture, anything to avoid thinking about the choice I had made. But the first strong gusts of wind made the entire house shudder, and for the first time that day, a cold fear ran through my chest. When the power went out, the silence inside became overwhelming. No lights, no television, no background noise, just the rising roar of the storm outside. The wind grew louder every minute, turning into a deep, violent howl that felt like it could peel the roof away. Rain hit the walls with a force that sounded like stones being thrown. The structure groaned and creaked under the pressure. A sudden crash shook the entire house as debris slammed into the siding. Objects fell to the floor, shelves toppled, and I felt the vibrations beneath my feet. That was when I finally moved to the bathroom, the only room in the house with no windows, telling myself it was just a precaution. But deep down, I knew it was fear, real fear. The kind that settles in your stomach and makes your hands cold. I sat on the bathroom floor, listening to the storm rip at everything I had worked for. And even then, I didn't understand how much worse it was about to get. Andrew hadn't even shown his real strength yet. Sitting on the bathroom floor, I tried to steady my breathing, but the storm outside grew more violent with every passing minute. The walls vibrated as if something enormous was repeatedly slamming into them. I could hear objects being torn away, crashing and grinding against each other outside, like the hurricane was shredding everything in its path. The pressure in the air changed suddenly, making my ears pop, and the temperature seemed to drop all at once. That was the moment I realized Andrew was directly over us. The wind outside wasn't just loud anymore, it was deafening. It sounded like a jet engine pressed against the house. I felt the foundation shudder beneath me, as though the storm was trying to lift the entire structure. The roof creaked so violently that I could hear nails being pulled loose. Every second felt like a countdown to something worse. Then the house began to break open. First came the ripping scream of wood splitting somewhere near the kitchen, followed by the heavy thud of something large collapsing. Pieces of drywall cracked behind me, dust fell from the ceiling. The bathroom door shook in its frame, as if invisible hands were pounding on it. The walls outside the bathroom groaned, bending under the force. It felt like the entire building was being peeled apart layer by layer. A sudden blast of pressure made the bathroom walls flex inward, and I finally understood that the house wasn't going to survive this. Andrew was far stronger than anything I had prepared for. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, merging with the roar of the storm. The only thing I could do was brace myself and hope that the bathroom, the smallest, sturdiest room, would hold long enough to save my life. Then came the moment everything changed. A massive impact hit the roof, followed by the unmistakable sound of it being torn away. It wasn't a gradual lifting, it was a violent, ripping explosion. The wind surged through the house like a living force, tearing through rooms, lifting objects, destroying the familiar shape of my home. The floor trembled as if the storm itself had grabbed the structure and shaken it. I curled into the corner of the bathroom, arms over my head, feeling the hurricane pull at the house with monstrous strength. I could hear walls collapsing, furniture crashing, the shriek of metal twisting. The storm wasn't just destroying, it was uprooting. It was in that moment, hidden in that small room, that I finally understood the mistake that nearly cost me everything. And Andrew was far from finished with me. The moment the roof tore away, everything changed. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, an explosive, violent ripping, as if the sky had reached down and yanked the top of my home into the darkness. The air pressure dropped so fast that my chest tightened. Wind rushed through the house with a force that felt almost intelligent, pulling, twisting, lifting anything it could grab. I felt it pushing under the floorboards, rattling the pipes, tugging at the walls from every direction. Then the impossible happened. The house began to move, not shake, not tilt. Move. I could feel the floor lifting beneath me, rising in uneven, terrifying jerks. It felt like the ground itself had liquefied. The bathroom walls trembled so violently that dust filled the air, coating my tongue with bitterness. The entire house creaked and groaned as if every beam was screaming under the force tearing at it. I held onto the base of the toilet as the room tilted slightly, then leveled, then tilted again. The sensation was unreal, like being inside a box someone was trying to rip off the ground. The roar of the hurricane drowned out every other sound except the deep, grinding moan of the foundation loosening. I felt a sudden surge upward, almost like a lift going too fast, and my stomach dropped. That was the moment I realized the house had actually left the earth. Debris slammed into the outside walls, making hollow, violent thuds that echoed through the bathroom. I could hear the rest of the house being torn apart midair, wood breaking, metal twisting, cabinets shattering. It felt like the storm was shaking my life apart piece by piece. I stayed curled on the cold bathroom floor, gripping whatever I could as the structure beneath me swayed like a fragile shell caught in a monster's hands. Then came the fall. It started with a sickening lurch downward, followed by a heavy, accelerating drop that sent my body weightless for a brief, horrifying moment. When the house hit the ground again, the impact was brutal. The floor slammed into my knees and elbows. The walls cracked like splintering bones. The air filled with dust and fragments of insulation. The jolt knocked the breath out of me, leaving my lungs burning and my ears ringing. For a moment, everything went strangely quiet inside my head, even though the storm still raged outside. I could barely tell which direction was up. The bathroom had shifted, tilted slightly to one side, but somehow still remained mostly intact. It was the only part of the house that hadn't collapsed around me. I lay there, trembling, realizing that I had survived the fall by sheer luck. But the storm wasn't over, and the house was no longer protecting me. When the house finally stopped moving, I stayed frozen on the bathroom floor, waiting for the next impact. My ears rang from the violent crash, and the air was thick with insulation, dust, and splintered wood. The storm still roared outside, but something about the sound had changed. It was distant, still violent, but not pressing against the walls with the same crushing force. The bathroom felt strangely still, almost suspended in silence compared to what it had been moments earlier. It took several seconds before I realized what was happening. The eye of the hurricane was passing over me. The air pressure shifted again, but this time it wasn't painful. The wind died just enough for me to hear my own breathing. The storm outside didn't vanish, but it retreated in a way that felt unnatural, like a predator stepping back before striking again. The sudden calm felt more terrifying than the chaos. It was a reminder that the worst half of the storm was still coming. Only then did I gather the courage to push the bathroom door open. It stuck at first, warped from the impact, but eventually gave way. When I stepped out, the sight stole the breath from my lungs. The house was gone, not damaged, not partially collapsed. Gone. Only fragments of walls remained around the bathroom, jagged and broken like bones sticking out of the earth. The roof had vanished entirely. The kitchen, living room, and bedrooms had been scraped clean off the foundation. The floor beneath me was cracked, shifted, and littered with debris, shards of glass, pieces of insulation, twisted metal, broken furniture. It looked nothing like a home. It looked like a wound carved into the ground. The neighborhood around me was unrecognizable. Houses that once stood side by side were flattened, reduced to bare slabs of concrete. Tree trunks lay snapped in half, stripped of branches. Cars were overturned or shoved into places they didn't belong. The entire street was a tangle of debris and broken memories. A heavy stillness hung in the air, the eerie quiet of the storm's eye hovering above us like a lid. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned, trying to process the fact that I had survived inside the only room still standing. The bathroom, those 3 remaining walls had saved my life. Everywhere else, destruction stretched in every direction. As I scanned the ruins, my stomach twisted. In the distance, I saw movement among the debris, figures climbing out from collapsed homes, some limping, some struggling, some barely able to stand. The realization settled into my chest. Many had stayed behind, just like I had, and many had not been as lucky. A faint rumble began to build in the distance. The wind shifted again, colder, sharper. The second half of the storm was returning. The hour was closing, and I had only minutes to find safety before Andrew came back with full force. The brief stillness inside the eye didn't last. The wind began to shift with a low, rising growl, like the storm clearing its throat before screaming again. I felt it in my skin first, tiny cold needles brushing against my arms, followed by a faint vibration under my feet. Andrew was circling back, and I knew the second half would be worse. Everyone always said the backside of a hurricane was the real killer. I had never understood what that meant until now. There was no roof above me anymore, only the swirling wall of clouds looming overhead, the eye closing like a massive lid. The edges were already darkening, spiraling, folding into themselves as the monster regained its strength. I knew staying in what was left of my house was suicide. Those 3 broken bathroom walls had survived once, but the next round would tear them apart like paper. I had minutes, maybe less, to reach another structure still standing. My first instinct was to run toward my neighbor's home, or what was left of it. From where I stood, it looked battered, but the foundation seemed more intact than mine. A portion of the living room still had walls, and the frame hadn't fully collapsed. It wasn't safe, but it was safer than remaining exposed. I forced my legs to move, dodging shattered wood, mangled metal, and debris ripped clean from roofs miles away. Every step felt like walking into a battlefield. Even during the eye's quiet, the destruction made it hard to move quickly. The ground was uneven, littered with sharp edges and tangled wires. I nearly tripped twice, catching myself on a broken fence post. The sky above me continued to darken, and a cold gust blew through the ruins, a warning that the storm had found its breath again. As I reached the street, I finally saw what had happened to the neighborhood I once knew so well. Entire blocks were stripped to their skeletons. Houses were flattened beyond recognition. Trees lay uprooted, cars tossed like toys, pieces of roofs wrapped around telephone poles. It was devastation so absolute that for a moment, my mind refused to register it as real. It looked like the aftermath of an explosion, not a storm. I wasn't alone out there. Other survivors emerged from splintered homes, limping through debris with blank expressions, trying to understand the world that had replaced their street. Some clutched bruised arms, others held onto children or elderly parents. We were all dazed, like people who had crawled out from underground after a war. The wind picked up another notch, sharp enough to sting my cheeks. The edge of the owl was almost overhead. I could see the solid wall of the hurricane rotating back toward us, a churning ring of dark clouds and violent motion. The sound began as a low drone, then deepened into a distant roar. Time was up. I pushed harder, moving as fast as I could toward the neighbor's remains. Just as I reached their crumbled walkway, the air pressure shifted violently again. A shockwave thumped in my ears. The first gust of the returning storm slammed into the street, ripping loose debris into the air. Dust and dirt blasted against my skin. I had seconds, maybe only one more breath, before the full force of the hurricane returned. The storm returned with no hesitation, as if it had been waiting for me to step into the open. The first blast hit so hard it knocked the breath from my lungs. I stumbled forward, leaning my entire weight into the wind just to keep from being thrown backward. The roar was deafening now, no longer a sound, but a force, a living creature snarling as it swept over the neighborhood for a second time. I pushed toward my neighbor's house, but the ground was shifting beneath me. Loose debris skidded across the pavement, scraping past my ankles. Sheets of metal flapped through the air like deadly wings. Every step felt like walking in chest-high water, except the current was sideways and determined to tear me off the earth. The brief calm of the eye had tricked my body into believing I could recover. But now the cold rain returned in violent bursts, slashing at my skin like handfuls of gravel. I shielded my face with my arm, though it did little to soften the impact. The temperature had dropped fast, enough to send shivers through my soaked clothes. I tried to stay low, moving quickly toward the neighbor's living room, one of the only structures still holding upright walls. But before I reached it, a new surge of wind swept across the street. It felt like an invisible hand lifting everything around me. I dropped to my knees just in time as a large piece of roofing sailed overhead, spinning like a giant blade. It crashed somewhere behind me with a metallic thud I couldn't afford to look back at. The storm felt different now, meaner, heavier, fueled by raw violence. I knew the backside of a hurricane was unpredictable, but nothing had prepared me for the intensity. Objects weren't just blowing around, they were being hurled with purpose. The pressure kept changing, making my ears pop painfully. The air felt thick, then thin, then thick again, each shift causing my chest to tighten. I crawled the last few feet toward what remained of the neighbor's entrance. The frame shook violently, threatening to break apart at any second. Inside, the house was a skeleton. Exposed beams rattled overhead. The floor was littered with pieces of shattered glass and soaked insulation. But at least the walls still offered some resistance against the force outside. The instant I reached the doorway, the wind shifted again, this time from behind me. It caught my soaked clothes like a sail, nearly pulling me backward. I threw my weight forward and slid through the entrance just as another violent gust tore across the street. Inside, the air was still chaos, but at least the wind wasn't strong enough to rip me from the ground. The structure groaned around me. Every creak sounded like a warning that the next second could bring total collapse. I braced myself against a support beam, forcing myself to breathe slowly, trying to steady the panic clawing at my chest. The storm outside screamed with renewed force, rattling the fragile walls around me. The entire house trembled like a trapped animal fighting against something far larger and far angrier. I knew this shelter wouldn't last long. I needed to think of my next move, but my mind fought between survival instincts and overwhelming fear. The hurricane was far from finished with us, and I understood, with terrifying clarity, that making it through the second half would require more than luck. The house around me shook with a violence that felt personal, as if the storm had singled out every remaining structure and vowed to tear them apart. I held onto the support beam with every bit of strength I had left. My muscles trembled, my breath came in sharp bursts, and my vision blurred from exhaustion and debris stinging my eyes. The wind outside screamed in a pitch that felt almost human, a sound of rage and destruction blending into one endless roar. Minutes stretched into something unrecognizable. Time became a series of impacts with snapping, metal scraping, objects crashing against the remaining walls. Every sound made my heart lurch, expecting the ceiling to give way. The pressure kept shifting until it felt like the air itself was tightening around my chest. My entire body buzzed with adrenaline, but underneath it was an overwhelming sense of disbelief. I was still alive, somehow. The structure groaned louder, and a portion of the roof peeled away, sucked upward into the darkness like it weighed nothing. Rain poured inside in relentless sheets. The wind reached into the living room through the widening gap, grabbing loose debris and whipping it around the interior. I pressed myself closer to the beam, trying to make my body as small as possible. My hands were numb, and my legs shook with a mix of fear and fatigue. But then, almost as suddenly as the violence had returned, the storm's fury began to soften. The wind lost a fraction of its strength, still brutal but less focused. The pitch of the hurricane's scream dropped, no longer the ear-splitting roar it had been for hours. The ground continued to tremble, but the impacts became scattered instead of constant. A strange, hesitant quiet crept into the gaps between gusts. I didn't trust it at first. My mind refused to believe the storm had finally begun to move on. But slowly, the realization settled into me. The worst was passing. After all the destruction, the hurricane was finally loosening its grip on what was left of our lives. When the wind weakened enough for me to push myself upright, my legs barely held me. I stepped carefully over broken wood and shattered glass, moving toward what used to be the front of the house. The door had vanished, leaving only a jagged frame. Beyond it, the world looked nothing like the place I had known. The street was a twisted landscape of splintered homes, overturned cars, and scattered memories. But there were survivors. People emerged from the wreckage like shadows, stunned, limping, covered in debris. Their eyes reflected the same disbelief I felt, the same quiet gratitude. We stood among the ruins with the understanding that we had lived through something no person should ever face. As I walked through what remained of my neighborhood, the magnitude of the loss hit me in waves. My home was gone. My possessions, my history, the physical pieces of my life all wiped away in a single night. But beneath all that devastation, there was a strange, fragile truth. I was still here. The storm had taken almost everything from me, but it hadn't taken my life. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of Hurricane Andrew, I realized survival itself was the only thing that truly mattered.